The Colonial Land Patent System of Maryland, a paper researched by the highly regarded professional land surveyor and professional engineer Ralph Donnelly, late of Hancock, Maryland. Presented by MISA, the MidAtlantic Surveyor Education Institute. I'm Bob Mead, Executive Director of MISA, a provider of continuing education programs for land surveyors, and a preferred provider approved by the Maryland State Board for Professional Land Surveyors since 2002. Ralph gave me a copy of the paper some years ago, and I recently became a ponent in an old file. Ralph expressed his hope that this program would give present-day land surveyors more insight into the process by which our system of land ownership evolved.
John Kilty and published in 1808. Kilty was a lawyer who had been appointed Register of the Land Office for the western shore of the state of Maryland. If the persons holding a similar office under the proprietary government are included, he was the 20th person to hold that office. From 1637 to 1777, 17 individuals held the post. St. George Peake and John Callahan had preceded Kilty under the state government. In the remarkable preface, Kilty opens by explaining, "I have undertaken in the ensuing inquiries, the development of a system of great and general interest, but which may circumstances have combined to render intricate and obscure." He closes by stating, "I submit the result of my labor to the candid judgment of the public." When Kilty took office, he expected to find laws, rules, and directions telling him how to perform his duties. He found none of these, and proceeded to bring order out of chaos. I hope that this paper will give present-day surveyors more insight into the process by which our system of land ownership evolved. Ralph H. Donnelly, September 21, 1978. The Colonial Land Patent System in Maryland. The land patents issued by Lord Baltimore were based on the charter which granted him certain land in North America. It named the area after Harriet Maria, which was translated Maryland. In turn, the grant to Baltimore was sustained by the exploration of Cabot, in 1498. The first settlement in North America was made in 1584, and in 1631 Baltimore was given the grant by King Charles. Baltimore's brother, Leonard, arrived here in 1633 to be the resident governor. The reports seem to indicate that about 140 people came to the new colony with the first group, arriving in 1634. The timing of their landing in the New World was planned around the start of the growing season, so that they would be able to plant and harvest their crops before winter. Included among the original settlers were 17 gentlemen financiers, who provided the money to start the colony. Another 20 were transported and their passage paid for by the Jesuits. Thus, of the entire party, about 103 were servants or working class people that formed the original colony. This comes to about 6 workers for each supervisor. The significance of this figure is that under the agreement then in effect, known as the conditions of plantation, if the investor brought in 5 men, he could claim 10 acres per man. It has been estimated that the cost of transporting a person was about £20. Simple computations indicate that the investor would then have to pay about 5 cents per acre, or the 500 acres that he would be granted in return, or bring this many people to the new colony. From his experience in Newfoundland, Calvert knew that it would take several years before the colony could be self-sustaining. He attempted to recruit wealthy people who could carry it through this time of development, and finally bring it into a profitable arrangement. This portion of Calvert's scheme actually never evolved to the extent he intended. Within a short time, most of the people who had come over as servants and field workers worked out their passage. Then, in a country where there was such an enormous amount of land available, they tried to acquire some of that land and establish themselves as independent planters. This, of course, led to a great increase in the number of patents, as well as the surveys and descriptions necessary to issue them. Baltimore put a very large portion of his own fortune into this colony, and paid about 1/3 of the cost for the ship which was to bring the people over. He personally financed the passage of about 25 of the servants on the first expedition. One of the prominent people among the gentlemen was Thomas Cornwallis, an ancestor of the Cornwallis that later became famous in the Revolution. Most of the gentlemen investors were the second or third generation sons of prominent families who, under the English system, would not inherit the fortune and lands of their fathers. Baltimore purchased some land from the native inhabitants before he landed, and thus established amicable relations with them. He realized that it would be very dangerous to the colony if the natives were antagonized, and he declared it illegal for anyone to seize what he called Indian land. The native people from whom he purchased their land, claimed that they were going to move to the north because they were afraid of attack by other hostile native warriors. They were not at all reluctant to receive some trinkets for the land as they moved away. The Charter of Maryland, which is appended here, contains many sweeping rights, The one we will be particularly interested in is that which establishes the tenures, which is the 5th article of the chapter. It gives Baltimore the right to sell as fee simple, fee in tail, for the term of life, or lives, or years, any part of the lands that he had been granted. Tenure was basically an institution, the great object of which was defense. All lands belonged to the sovereign after conquest. They were parceled out on conditions requiring the receiver to perform services, and in return the Lord must provide protection. To encourage people to populate this new colony, Baltimore published what were known as the Conditions of Plantation in 1633. A complete copy of the very early conditions is not extant, but the copy of 1636 provided that for every 5 men between the ages of 16 and 50 that were brought to the colony, 2,000 acres would be granted to the person paying for their passage. The annual rent was set at 40 pounds of good wheat. These grants were to be infeasible estates of inheritance to the grantees and their heirs forever. In 1641, the conditions of plantation required that 20 persons come over in 1 year, and then they would receive 2,000 acres. A further requirement was that the settlers bring 1 musket with snap-house lock, then pounds of powder, 40 pounds of lead, a sword and a belt, a bandoleer and a flask. It was stipulated that within 12 months of their arrival they must apply for their land grant. Many of them were very reluctant to do so because as soon as they were enrolled on the books as landholders, they were subject to certain taxes and requirements. In addition, one of the earliest subdivision restrictions appears here, stipulating that no person be allowed more than 50 poles of frontage along the water for every acres of area in the rear. The Surveyor General and the Land Records. The title of Surveyor General was first held by John Langford in 1641. His instructions required the listing and supervision of all the castles, manors, forest chases, parks, tenement lands, woods, and also the collection of the rent revenues from all possessions and hereditaments of the lands owned by Baltimore. He was instructed to survey 2 manors of 6,000 acres each, in each county and reserve all places convenient for fortifications. Langford was also required to keep a record book of all lands granted and make 2 copies, one to send each year to his lordship and one to the receiver general. The latter also collected import duties and all of the revenues due Baltimore. The steps by which these adventurers, as they were called, could obtain a patent, required that they appear before an officer authorized to issue a warrant. They then would have to provide witnesses under oath to prove that they had complied with the conditions of plantation to the extent they had claimed, and demand a warrant be issued by the proprietary. The warrant would be signed by the governor and directed the surveyor general, who executed it and returned a certificate of survey. If no objection was heard, the patent was issued and sealed and signed by the governor. A common method of transferring title to lands which had been patented was to endorse on the back of the title, "I hereby assign this to so and so." This loose method went on for many years, and it was not until 1680 that a district land office not blended with other offices was created. A typical early warrant reads, "Lay out sometime before midsummer next, at the furthest, for Thomas Pettit 200 acres and Johnson Gay 100 at any part on the north side of the Patuxent River not before disposed of." An additional example of a warrant, dated 1641, reads, "Lay out sometime before Michaelmas next, at the furthest, 4,000 acres on any part of the Potomac River upwards of Port Tobacco Creek for Thomas Conwally and bounded with the most natural bounds, as near as you may, to the figure of a parallelogram." The description in the patent, which was issued after the certificate of survey had been returned for one warrant issued for lands within the city of St. Mary's, reads as follows. "Land laying nearest together about Smith Forge lately built by Gills Brent were as the northbound being at a marked tree on the top of the hill on southerly side of the swamp, called the Key Swamp, and running by a straight east line above the head of the swamp is laid out for 105 perches, the east side beginning at the end of the said 105 perch line, and running through the forest by a straight line is laid out by 110 perch. The south side beginning at the end of said 110 perches and running west, northwest, or near that point to the corner of a close now hedge in by bent and along the hedge to Teehee bank of St. George's River to the aforesaid marked tree is laid out for 80 perches or thereabouts." John Lugger, Surveyor.
Improving the system. The unrefined system caused such confusion that by 1671 a special law was passed to declare all previous sales legal. Many of the sales which had been by endorsements on the back of patents, by letters, or merely by word of mouth, had never been recorded. In a further effort to prevent confusion, the examination of certificates of survey was started in 1685 by the creation of the Office of the Examiner, to which post Thomas Tyler was appointed. One surveyor returned so many false descriptions that he was forbidden to execute further warrants. Provisions were made to allow people in the neighborhood of a new survey to protest it. However, no legal action could be taken until a patent was issued. Then the case would be tried by the governor. In later years, there were judges within the land office who would try these cases. Land in an area in which the title was held by Baltimore was disputed, which was every side of the province, was sold at half price, with deferred payments allowed. This included territory in the peninsula south of Ocean City, where there was a dispute with Virginia, on the eastern boundary, where there was a dispute concerning the line with what is now Delaware, and of course along the northern boundary, where there was an extended dispute with the Penns. The records indicate that by 1642 over 37,000 acres of land had been surveyed. This had been accomplished in 8 years. It appears that about 90% of this patented land was untouched and not under cultivation. Practically all of the sites were chosen for their suitability for tobacco production. This had proven to be a reliable source of income, and with the collapse of the fur trade became almost the only source of income. Access to a port was necessary because all of the tobacco was shipped to England or Holland. Of the several manors which were established in the early days, there was only one which seemed to have really functioned in the style intended. It was known as St. Clemens Manor and was established by Thomas Garrett. Lord Baltimore had envisioned a city somewhat within the colony which would be the center of his manorial system. While the choice became St. Mary's, the pattern of land distribution that appeared in the town was not at all that which had been intended. Approximately 1,500 acres had been assigned as the city-state, originally thought to be suitable for small lots, perhaps 5 to 10 acres. The system of partitioning the land actually parceled out areas from 50 to several hundred acres, with an average of over 100 acres. Some of these were subdivided by leases, but St. Mary's never resembled a village. The small number of households there, perhaps as many as a dozen, were spread out over several square miles. When the capital was moved from St. Mary's in 1695, the town rapidly disappeared. By 1725, it was virtually dead. In 1642 there were 100 free men known to be living in the colony. Included in the free population were 6 esquires and 13 gentlemen. Among these 19, there were merchants, planters, Indian traders, money lenders, and estate developers. That sounds like a modern list. The usual term of the indentured worker was 4 years. At the end of that time, according to the Act of 1640, a servant was then to be given a good cloth suit of jersey of broad cloth, a shirt of white linen, a pair of stocking and shoes, 2 hoes, 1 axe, 3 barrels of corn, and 50 acres of land, 5, at least, to be plantable. Records indicate that many times the master would make the servant whose term was up pay for the survey and the clerk's fee, as well as the other requirements to transfer title. It was generally assumed that a man could produce about 1,000 pounds of tobacco a year. A warrant for a 50-acre tract of land could be purchased for approximately 100 pounds of tobacco, and sometimes for a little less. Thus, it would appear that it took the equivalent of about 1 day of work to acquire an acre of ground.
The colonial land patent system in Maryland, the Great Land Market. 500.